Chapter 12, Part 3 of Etiquette. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel Ellen. Etiquette in Society, in Business, in Politics, and at Home, by Emily Post. Chapter 12, The Well-Appointed House. Part 3. Courtesy to one's household. In a dignified house, a servant is never spoken to as Jim, Maisie, or Katy, but always as James, or Margaret, or Catherine, and a butler is called by his last name nearly always. The worldly's butler, for instance, is called Hastings, not John. In England, a lady's maid is also called by her last name, and the cook, if married, is addressed as Mrs., and the nurse is always called nurse. A chef is usually called chef, or else by his last name. Always abroad, and every really well-bred lady or gentleman here says please in asking that something be brought to her or him. Please get me the book I left on the table in my room, or please give me some bread, or some bread, please. Or one can say equally politely, and omit the please, I'd like some toast, but it is usual and instinctive to every lady or gentleman to add please. In refusing a dish at the table, one must say, no thank you, or no thanks, or else shakes one's head. A head can be shaken politely or rudely. To be courteously polite, and yet keep one's walls up, is a thing every thoroughbred person knows how to do, and a thing that everyone who is trying to become such must learn to do. A rule can't be given because there isn't any. As said in another chapter, a well-bred person always lives within the walls of his personal reserve. A vulgarian has no walls, or at least none that do not collapse at the slightest touch. But those who think they appear superior by being rude to others whom fortune has placed below them, might as well, did they but know it, shout their own unexalted origin to the world at large, since by no other method could it be more widely published. The house with limited service. The fact that you live in a house with 2 servants, or in an apartment with only 1, need not imply that your house lacks charm or even distinction, or that it is not completely the home of a lady or gentleman. But, as explained in the chapter on dinners, if you have limited service, you must devise systematic economy of time and labor, or you will have disastrous consequences. Every person, after all, has only 1 pair of hands, and a day has only so many hours, and one thing is inevitable, which young housekeepers are apt to forget: a few cannot do the work of many, and do it in the same way. It is all very well if the housemaid cannot get into young Mrs. Gilding's room until lunch-time, nor does it matter if its confusion looks like the aftermath of a cyclone. The housemaid has nothing to do the rest of the day but put that one room and bath in order. But in young Mrs. Gailey's small house, where the housemaid is also the waitress, who is supposed to be dressed for lunch, it does not have to be pointed out that she cannot sweep, dust, tidy up rooms, wash out bathtubs, polish fixtures, and at the same time be dressed in afternoon clothes. If Mrs. Gailey is out for lunch, it is true the chambermaid waitress need not be dressed to wait on table, but her thoughtless young mistress would not be amiable if a visitor were to ring the doorbell in the early afternoon and have it opened by a maid in a rumpled working dress. Supposing the time to put the bedroom in order is from 10 to 11 each morning. It is absolutely necessary that Mrs. Gailey take her bath before 10, so that even if she is not otherwise dressed, she can be out of her bedroom and bath at 10 o'clock promptly. She can go elsewhere while her room is done up, and then come back and finish dressing later. In this case she must herself tidy any disorder that she makes in dressing, put away her negligee and slippers, and put back anything out of place. On the days when Mr. Gailey does not go to the office, he too must get up and out, so that the house can be put in order. The one maid alone. But where one maid alone cooks, cleans, waits on table, and furthermore serves as lady's maid and valet, she must necessarily be limited in the performance of each of these duties in direct proportion to their number. Even though she be eagerly willing, quality must give way before quantity produced with the same equipment, or if quality is necessary, then quantity must give way. In the house of a fashionable gay couple like the Lovejoys, for instance, the time spent in maiding or valeting has to be taken from cleaning or cooking. Besides cleaning and cooking, the one maid in their small apartment can press out Mrs. Lovejoy's dresses and do a little mending, but she cannot sit down and spend 1 or 2 hours going over a dress in the way a specialist maid can. Either Mrs. Lovejoy herself must do the sewing or the housework, or one or the other must be left undone. The management of servants. It is certainly a greater pleasure and incentive to work for those who are appreciative than for those who continually find fault. Everyone who did war work cannot fail to remember how easy it was to work for, or with, some people, and how impossible to get anything done for others. And just as the heads of workrooms or wards or canteens were either stimulating or dispiriting, so must they and their types also be to those who serve in their households. This perhaps explains why some people are always having a servant problem, finding servants difficult to get, more difficult to keep, and most difficult to get efficient work from. It is a question whether the servant problem is not more often a mistress problem. It must be, because, if you notice, those who have woes and complaints are invariably the same, just as others who never have any trouble are also the same. It does not depend on the size of the house. The Lovejoys never have any trouble, and yet their one maid-of-all-work has a far from easy place, and a vacancy at Brookmeadows is always sought after, even though the old names spend 10 months of the year in the country. Neither is there any friction at the Golden Hall or Great Estates, even though the latter house is run by the butler, an almost inevitable cause of trouble. These houses represent a difference in range from 1 alone to nearly 40 on the household payroll. Those who have persistent trouble. It might be well for those who have trouble to remember a few rules which are often overlooked. Justice must be the foundation upon which every tranquil house is constructed. Work must be as evenly divided as possible. One servant should not be allowed liberties not accorded to all. It is not just to be too lenient, any more than it is just to be unreasonably strict. To allow impertinence or sloppy work is inexcusable, but it is equally inexcusable to show causeless irritability or to be overbearing or rude. And there is no greater example of injustice than to reprimand those about you because you happen to be in a bad humor, and at another time overlook offenses that are greater because you are in an amiable mood. There is also no excuse for correcting either a servant or a child before people. And when you do correct, do not forget to make allowances, if there be any reason why allowance should be made. If you live in a palace like Golden Hall, or any completely equipped house of important size, you overlook nothing. There is no more excuse for delinquency than there is in the army. If anything happens, such as illness of one servant, there is another to take his or her place. A huge household is a machine, and it is the business of the engineers, in other words, the secretary, housekeeper, chef, or butler, to keep it going perfectly. But in a little house, it is not fair to say, Selma, the silver is dirty, when there is a hot air furnace, and you have had company to every meal, and you have perhaps sent her on errands between times, and she has literally not had a moment. If you don't know whether she has had time or not, you could give her the benefit of the doubt and say, trustfully, not haughtily, "You have not had time to clean the silver, have you?" This, in case she has really been unable to clean it, points out just as well the fact that it is not shining, but it is not a criticism. Carelessness, on the other hand, when you know she has had plenty of time, should never be overlooked. Another type that has difficulties is the distrustful, sometimes actually suspicious, person who locks everything tight and treats all those with whom she comes in contact as though they were meddlesomely curious at least, or at worst dishonest. It is impossible to overstate the misfortune of this temperament. The servant who is watched for fear she won't work, listened to for fear she may be gossiping, suspected of wanting to take a liberty of some sort, or of doing something else she shouldn't do, is psychologically encouraged, almost driven, to do those very things. The perfect mistress expects perfect service, but it never occurs to her that perfect service will not be voluntarily and gladly given. She, on her part, shows all of those in her employ the consideration and trust due them as honorable, self-respecting, and conscientious human beings. If she has reason to think they are not all this, a lady does not keep them in her house. Etiquette of Service. The well-trained, high-class servant is faultlessly neat in appearance, reticent in manner, speaks in a low voice, walks and moves quickly but silently, and is unfailingly courteous and respectful. She or he always knocks on a door, even of the library or sitting-room, but opens it without waiting to hear "Come in," as knocking on a downstairs door is merely politeness. At a bedroom door she would wait for permission to enter. In answering a bell she asks, "Did you ring, sir?" Or, if especially well-mannered, she asks, "Did madam ring?" A servant always answers, "Yes, madam," or "Very good, sir," never "Yes," "No," "All right," or "Sure." Young people in the house are called Miss Alice or Mr. Ollie, possibly Mr. Oliver, but they are generally called by their familiar names with the prefix of Miss or Mr. Young children are called Miss Kitty and Master Fred, but never by the nurse, who calls them by their first names until they are grown, sometimes always. All cards and small packages are presented on a tray. Time out and in. No doubt in the far-off districts there are occasional young women who work long and hard and for little compensation, but at least in all cities servants have their definite time out. Furthermore, they are allowed in humanely run houses to have times in, when they can be at home to friends who come to see them. In every well-appointed house of size there is a sitting-room which is furnished with comfortable chairs and sofa if possible, a good drop-light to read by, often books, and always magazines, sent out as soon as read by the family. In other words, they have an inviting room to use as their own, exactly as though they were living at home. If no room is available, the kitchen has a cover put on the table, a drop-light, and a few restful chairs are provided. The maids' men friends. Are maids allowed to receive men friends? Certainly they are. Whoever in remote ages thought it was better to forbid followers the house, and have Mary and Selma slip out of doors to meet them in the dark, had very distorted notions, to say the least. And any lady who knows so little of human nature as to make the same rule for her maids today, is acting in ignorant blindness of her own duties to those who are not only in her employ, but also under her protection. A pretty young woman whose men friends come in occasionally and play cards with the others, or dance to a small and not loud phonograph in the kitchen, is merely being treated humanely. Because she wears a uniform makes her no less a young girl, with a young girl's love of amusement, which, if not properly provided for her at home, will be sought for in sinister places. This responsibility is one that many ladies who are occupied with charitable and good works elsewhere often overlook under their own roof. It does not mean that the kitchen should be a scene of perpetual revelry and mirth that can by any chance disturb the quiet of the neighborhood or even the family. Unseemly noise is checked at once, much as it would be if young people in the drawing-room became disturbing. Continuous company is not suitable either, and those who abuse privileges naturally must have them curtailed, but the really high-class servant who does not appreciate kindness and requite it with consideration and proper behavior is rare. Service in formal entertaining. On the sidewalk and in the hall. For a wedding or a ball, and sometimes for teas and big dinners, there is an awning from curb to front door. But usually, especially in good weather, a dinner or other moderate-sized evening entertainment is prepared for by stretching a carpet, a red one invariably, down the front steps and across the pavement to the curb's edge. At all important functions there is a chauffeur, or a caterer's man, on the sidewalk to open the door of motors, and a footman or waitress stationed inside the door of the house to open it on one's approach. This same servant, or more often another stationed in the hall beyond, directs the arriving guests to the dressing-rooms. Dressing-rooms. Houses especially built for entertaining have two small rooms on the ground floor, each with its lavatory, and off of it a rack for the hanging of coats and wraps. In most houses, however, guests have to go upstairs, where two bedrooms are set aside, one as a lady's, and the other as a gentleman's coat-room. At an afternoon tea in houses where dressing-rooms have not been installed by the architect, the end of the hall, if it is wide, is sometimes supplied with a coat-rack, which may be rented from a caterer, for the gentlemen. Ladies are in this case supposed to go into the drawing-room as they are, or go upstairs to the bedroom put at their disposal and in charge of a lady's maid or housemaid. If the entertainment is very large, checks are always given to avoid confusion in the dressing-rooms exactly as in public check-rooms. In the ladies' dressing-room, whether downstairs or up, there must be an array of toilet necessities such as brushes and combs, well-placed mirrors, hairpins, powder with stacks of individual cotton balls, or a roll of cotton in a receptacle from which it may be pulled. In the lavatory there must be fresh soap and plenty of small hand towels. The lady's personal maid, and one or two assistants if necessary, depending on the size of the party, but one and all of them as neatly dressed as possible, assist ladies off and on with their wraps, and give them their coat checks. A lady's maid should always look the arriving guests over, not boldly nor too apparently, but with a quick glance for anything that may be amiss. If the drapery of a dress is caught up on its trimming, or a fastening undone, it is her duty to say, "Excuse me, madam, or miss, but there is a hook undone," or "The drapery of your gown is caught, shall I fix it?" which she does as quickly and quietly as possible. If there is a rip of any sort, she says, "I think there is a thread loose. I'll just tack it. It would only be a moment." The well-bred maid instinctively makes little of a guest's accident, and is as considerate as the hostess herself. Employees instinctively adopt the attitude of their employer. In the gentleman's coat-room of a perfectly appointed house, the valet's attitude is much the same. If a gentleman's coat should have met with any accident, the valet says, "Let me have it fixed for you, sir. It'll only take a moment." And he divests the gentleman of his coat, and takes it to a maid, and asks her please to take a stitch in it. Meanwhile he goes back to his duties in the dressing-room until he is sure the coat is finished, when he gets it, and politely helps the owner into it. In a small country house, where dressing-room space is limited, the quaint tables copied from old ones are very useful, screened off at the back of the downstairs hall, or in a very small lavatory. They look, when shut, like an ordinary table, but when the top is lifted, a mirror, the height of the table's width, swings forward, and a series of small compartments and trays, both deep and shallow, are laid out on either side. The trays, of course, are kept filled with hairpins, pins and powder, and the compartments have sunburn lotion and liquid powder, brush, comb and whisk broom, and whatever else the hostess thinks will be useful. The announcement of guests. The butler's duty is to stand near the entrance to the reception or drawing-room, and as each guest arrives, unless they are known to him, he asks, "What name, please?" He then leads the way into the room where the hostess is receiving, and says distinctly, "Mr. and Mrs. Jones." If Mrs. Jones is considerably in advance of her husband, he says, "Mrs. Jones," then waits for Mr. Jones to approach before announcing, "Mr. Jones." At a very large party, such as a ball, or a very big tea or musical, he does not leave his place, but stands just outside the drawing-room, and the hostess stands just within, and as the guests pass through the door, he announces each one's name. It is said to be customary, in certain places, to have waitresses announce people, but in New York guests are never announced if there are no men servants. At a very large function such as a ball or a tea, a hostess, who has no butler at home, always employs one for the occasion. If, for instance, she is giving a ball for her daughter, and all the sons and daughters of her own acquaintance are invited, the chances are that not half or even a quarter of her guests are known to her by sight, so that their announcement is not a mere matter of form, but of necessity. The announcement of dinner. When the butler, on entering the room to announce dinner, happens to catch the attention of the hostess, he merely bows. Otherwise, he approaches within speaking distance and says, "Dinner is served." He never says, "Dinner is ready." At a large dinner, where it is quite a promenade to circle the table in search of one's name, the butler stands just within the dining-room, and either reads from a list, or says from memory, right or left, as the case may be, to each gentleman and lady on approaching. In a few of the smartest houses a leaf has been taken from the practice of royalty, and a table plan arranged in the front hall, which is shown to each gentleman at the moment when he takes the envelope enclosing the name of his partner at dinner. This table plan is merely a diagram made in leather, with white name cards that slip into spaces corresponding to the seats at the table. On this a gentleman can see exactly where he sits and between whom, so that if he does not know the lady who is to be on his left, as well as the one he is to "take in," he has plenty of time before going to the table to ask his host to present him. At the end of the evening the butler is always at the front door, and by that time, unless the party is very large, he should have remembered their names, if he is a perfect butler, and as Mr. and Mrs. Jones appear he opens the door and calls down to the chauffeur, "Mr. Jones' car," and in the same way, "Mr. Smith's car," "Miss Gilding's car." When a car is at the door, the chauffeur runs up the steps and says to the butler, "Miss Gilding's car," or "Mrs. Jones' car." The butler then announces to either Mr. or Mrs. Jones, "Your car, sir," or "Your car, madam," and holds the door open for her to go out, or he may say, "Your car, miss," if the Gilding car comes first. Dining-room service at private entertainments. Supper at a ball in a great house, big enough for a ball, is usually in charge of the butler, who by supper-time is free from his duties of announcing, and is able to look after the dining-room service. The sit-down supper at a ball is served exactly like a dinner, or a wedding breakfast, and the buffet supper of a dance is like the buffet of a wedding reception. At a large tea where the butler is on duty announcing at the same time that other guests are going into the dining-room for refreshments, the dining-room service has to be handed over to the first footman and his assistants, or a capable waitress is equally able to meet the situation. She should have at least 2 maids with her, as they have to pour all cups of tea and bouillon and chocolate, as well as to take away used cups and plates and see that the food on the table is replenished. At a small tea, where ladies perform the office of pouring, 1 man or maid in the dining-room is plenty, to bring in more hot water or fresh cups, or whatever the table hostesses have need of. Formal service without men servants. Many, and very fastidious people, who live in big houses and entertain constantly, have neither men servants nor employ a caterer, ever. Efficient women take men's places equally well, though 2 services are omitted. Women never, in New York at least, announce guests or open the doors of motors, but there is no difference whatsoever in the details of the pantry, dining-room, hall or dressing-room, whether the services are performed by men or women. No women, of course, are ever on duty in gentlemen's dressing-rooms. At an evening party, the door is opened by the waitress, assisted by the parlour-maid, who directs the way to the dressing-rooms. The guests, when they are ready to go into the drawing-room, approach the hostess unannounced. A guest who may not be known by sight does not wait for her hostess to recognize her, but says at once, "How do you do, Mrs. Eminent? I'm Mrs. Joseph Blank." Or a young girl says, "I am Constance Style," not Miss Style unless she is beyond the 20s. Or a married woman merely announces herself as Mrs. Town. She does not add her husband's name, as it is taken for granted that the gentleman following her is Mr. Town. End of chapter 12.